To give you a flavor of me, I actually have touched on a lot of topics related to different people in the room, including studying applied mathematics as part of my training in complexity science earlier in my life, which shapes my thinking about the philosophy and history of science. I've always had a keen interest in worldviews, value systems, social norms, beliefs, especially when they don't match to reality, because that is incredibly interesting in a time like this, where it's so difficult to know what's actually going on. So the overlays between religion, worldviews, and things like politics, and then into the nitty-gritty of misinformation and propaganda and other sorts of things that are happening in the world today. There's a lot of interesting overlap. And I guess you all have a sense that the work that I've been participating in with people around the world is centered around the notion of regeneration, which is really a fundamental element of any living creature. So all living things have a capacity from moment to moment to reproduce the conditions of being alive. And so regeneration is this dynamic process of aliveness for all living organisms that can be seen at the scale of biological cells within any multicellular organism, all the way up to the scale of ecosystems or the biosphere writ large. And so this idea of regeneration as a way of thinking about design is to bring a lot of knowledge from the science of living systems into the realm of management, design of organizations and social policies, et cetera, things like this. And as I'll share briefly in some slides as we start to go along, I've come to the conclusion, I think as many other people have, that we cannot haphazardly find our way into a future that keeps humans intact as part of the planet. That actually we are at risk of going into some very disturbing disruptions that could lead to human extinction, among other things. And our future viability will require being intentional about sticking around. We have to have ways of choosing to continue being part of the biosphere of the earth, and then somehow connecting those intentions to practices that work in order to stabilize the ecosystems that we depend upon for our survival, because we've gotten so good at destabilizing them. So I consider the design of our collective future to be essential to including humans in that future. And so I'd like to talk with you today, as Ahmed had asked me to do, about some of the ideas that I've had for treating universities as locus points for, or platforms, if you will, for the integration of regenerative efforts at regional scales, and how to re-envision universities in this way. And the way I'd like to do this is I have some slides I've put together really just to stimulate discussion, and I want to go through them fairly quickly so that we have a lot more time for free form interaction rather than my presumed structuring of how to have the conversation. So really I see these slides that I'm going to share as something like a provocation for our conversation. And I hope that they bring up a lot of questions and even possibly concerns that you have that we can then begin to have discussion around and have a long interactive question and answer is I think a little too limiting, because it might lead to some interperson or peer-to-peer dialogue among people in your room and not simply asking my supposedly sagely advice. And I'm strongly of the opinion that no one has the knowledge to solve these problems. Only if we can bring together our collective capacities will we be able to do so. So with that in mind, I'd like to share some slides with you that I put together to help shape our conversation. And I have them right here. So the place that I'd like to start is by saying that the way that we restore planetary health requires us working at some intermediate scale, something smaller than planetary but larger than local. And I've come to the conclusion that bioregions are the appropriate scale for integrating our local efforts to create whole system solutions. But that if we only work in one bioregion, without creating a network across the entire planet, then planetary scale systems like the mixing processes of the ocean or the chemical composition of the atmosphere, things that are larger than regional scale, can overwhelm our local or regional efforts and cause them to become untenable. So I consider the regional scale to be essential, but that we can't do it in any one region. We need to create learning across regions for us to direct ourselves toward planetary goals. And you'll see that as I'll continue in bringing this conversation from the high level down to education. I have two primary claims that shape my approach to regenerating entire bioregions. The first is the observation that human activities have degraded landscapes all over the planet to the point where we are already in overshoot and collapse. So if you hear public discourse about climate change having 10 years before we cross some critical threshold, that is already a discourse that has reduced the interdependencies between different parts of the Earth system. And we have substantial evidence that we're already in overshoot. And there are several collapse dynamics already in play that we have to in some way manage, or at least manage our inability to manage the collapse process is already underway as we engage in regenerative work. The second claim that I have is that we have to restore or regenerate the functions of entire ecosystems, which requires working at regional scales. And that if we don't do this, we cannot ratchet up to the planetary scale in a way that would safeguard humanity's future. And so starting with the kind of global perspective, why do I say that we're already in planetary scale overshoot and collapse? I'd love to see a quick show of hands of who in the room is familiar with the planetary boundaries framework from the Stockholm Resilience Center, if you've heard of it. So a few of you, this is good. It's always surprising to me that this is not better known. So the Stockholm Resilience Center is a collaborative research community of Earth system scientists. And they have a nonprofit organization based in Stockholm that has been trying to create an integrated planetary scale perspective of global change as it relates to key parts of how the Earth functions. And what they've done is come up with a framework that they call planetary boundaries that has identified 9 key processes of the planet that have some threshold within them, that if we cross that threshold, then human civilization at a planetary scale becomes untenable. And they published a paper back in 2013 indicating that to the best of their knowledge by surveying the research literature, that we had already crossed 4 of the 9 boundaries, meaning that we're already in overshoot and that we can see destabilization of the planet is already underway. And what's interesting to see is if you look at these 9 different boundaries, things like climate change are pretty well known. Stratospheric ozone depletion, or the ozone hole, was very well known in the late 80s and early 90s. But others are less talked about, like the aggregate of land system change through deforestation, formation of cities, and other things that have changed the types of biomes across the planet, or the use of fresh water where there's scarcity of fresh water. But what's interesting is to see that the 2 of these 9 planetary boundaries that we've crossed the furthest, and that are in the most urgent way placing it at risk of collapsing our global system, are the loss of genetic diversity, which is basically the extinction processes that we see underway, the moving into a mass extinction event with loss of biodiversity, which can destabilize ecosystems and have cascading consequences, including the possibility of human extinction if it goes too far. And the second one that is the furthest along is biogeochemical flows, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, that are synthetically produced for fertilizers in the model of industrial agriculture. And these are creating the dead zones in all of the world's river systems and having cascading consequences across the ocean, including the possibility of collapsing the food chain by destabilizing marine ecosystems at a planetary scale. And so when we look at these different planetary boundaries, what we see is that by our knowledge that still has incompleteness and uncertainty, that we've already overshot several of them. And interestingly, climate change has overshot the safe zone, which is the small blue circle here in the middle, but is not in the danger zone, which would be the red circle. You see they're concentric circles within each other. But this visualization gives us a powerful way of thinking about how we can coordinate our efforts toward global goals very differently from the 17 Sustainable Development Goals developed by the United Nations. Because here what we have is we have to get within the safe operating range for all 9 of them, and we know which ones we're furthest over. And what's interesting is land system change, biodiversity loss, and biogeochemical cycles are all strongly connected to industrial agriculture, meaning that if we somehow could replace industrial agriculture with more ecologically healthy models of food production, that it would go a long way toward getting us back within the planetary boundaries. That this framework gives us a way of thinking about how to manage systemic problems with systemic solutions, which I find really powerful for organizing our activities. So another piece of this that I think is really important is to look at what are called functional landscapes as an organizing principle for how we cooperate to solve global and local problems. And the watershed is a classic example, that the drainage basin of water running downhill, creating a set of ecological functions on a landscape, is an example of how the landscape has functions that we can understand and then come to manage them. And our best environmental management practices involve functional landscapes, whether it's the filtration process of water in a watershed, or it's a coastal estuary as part of a fishery system, or other regional scale management practices. They organize the human cooperation around the functions of the landscape itself. And so this gives us a really powerful insight for how to build management systems or take existing management systems and start to put them together as a way of doing economic development for regional economies that we can use to begin to cooperate at this regional scale. So I see the global problems as being really important to understand that we've already overshot several key thresholds and destabilized key processes of the entire planet. But this intermediate scale of functional landscapes is something that's concrete and tangible. We have a track record of management being done successfully at this scale, especially the examples in things like sustainable fisheries in the last 10 or 15 years, but also in some of the island economies that have done things with functional landscapes at this scale, that tell us that it is a viable approach to connect the local to the global. Now, when we take this and start to think about it in terms of bioregions, what makes a bioregion into a bioregion is to combine those functional landscapes like watersheds, coastal estuaries, mountain ranges, and so forth, and overlay on top of them the human subsistence systems that create coherent cultural identities for an entire region. And a really well-known example of this is Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest, where I have been living. As some of you may know, my family is kind of nomadic and homeless at the moment, spending the last year in Costa Rica, and right now we're bike touring into different places. But we spent a lot of time living in the Pacific Northwest. What's interesting about bioregions is that there is a kind of evolved cultural identity that is related to the landscape itself, where people say, we are the people of this region. And there's a coherence to their economic activities as well as their cultural identity that has a long-standing history in the region. And so it overlays the ecosystem functions, which are defined in a more scientific or ecological way, combines them with cultural functions or cultural features that are understood in a more sociological way. And when you put the two of them together, you have a way of organizing your thinking about economic development for a region. So the basic idea that I have worked with in my thinking for how we begin to approach education to do regeneration at bioregional scales actually comes from the field of cultural evolution, what I've noticed is that one way of thinking about the ecological crisis at planetary scales, as well as at local scales, is to see that the driver of ecological change for the human species has been what's called social niche construction. Now, niche construction in a general kind of biological sense is understood with examples like the beaver that creates a dam in a river and then changes the flow and the structure of the river. But then the next generation of beavers can inherit that changed ecosystem. And the niche that they constructed by changing the river system itself becomes part of the inheritance for the future generation of beavers. While social niche construction is that same idea applied to human social, institutional, and technological landscapes. So just like we have genetic inheritance in biology, and we can have cultural inheritance in terms of learning social norms and stories and technological practices and so forth, we also can have environmental landscape or situational inheritance by having landscapes that have changed that then we accumulate and build upon. And the best known examples of this are built environments in urban landscapes, where if I'm born into New York City, I don't have to rebuild the subway system. It's just part of the landscape that I inherit as a social niche created by previous humans in that place. Well, one of the ways that ecological change has been accelerated by human beings is that we are able to ratchet up or accelerate the pathway of social change in these inherited environments, leading to exponential changes and what I call runaway cultural evolution, which is that the compounding effects can become so fast that we lose the ability to adapt to our social environments that are changing more quickly than human evolution is really in our ancestral environments. We didn't develop the psychological capabilities or the cognitive capabilities to adapt to changing environments at these speeds and scales. So many of our problems come about because of social niche construction and the runaway cultural evolution that is accompanied by it. And this creates a really interesting way of thinking about education and the role of universities. But just to give a sense of globally how this has played out, if you look at the last roughly 100 years, as the human population has exploded in an exponential way, it's really interesting to notice that the rate of extinction for non-human species has tracked it almost perfectly. And one way I think about this is when I put on my physics hat and think about the concept of entropy, which is the measure of information in any system to fully characterize that system. Entropy is that measurement. You can see that as the complexity of human societies has gone up, the corresponding complexity of the Earth's biosphere has gone down. We have degraded landscapes, replaced complex ecosystems with thousands of species, with monoculture crops, and with degraded landscapes with much fewer species in them, and much lower complexity ecosystems. And that this is actually an indication of a runaway cultural evolution process, which at some point will cause the entire biosphere to unravel, which is what's called a mass extinction event. And that's what threatens to take humans down with it. But we can see this as a consequence of changing our landscapes through human social and technological processes that have the indirect consequence of degrading the landscapes around them. So one of my claims is that if cultural evolution in this way has caused the ecological crisis, then the only way to solve it is to design cultural evolution by applying what we know about these processes to guide the future developments of humanity, which gets us back to managing those functional landscapes at bioregional scales. So the current work that I'm involved with is trying to create viable models for guiding the cultural evolution of bioregions. How do we intentionally map out through things like multi-stakeholder collaboration processes? How do we map out what is happening in a region, create shared agendas and frameworks for cooperation, and then set up monitoring and evaluation systems to direct ourselves within those regions toward goals in the future? And how can we do that in some kind of learning system from region to region that forms into a global network. So the basic idea here is that if you have local metrics for social well-being and ecological health, like what is the soil carbon that's captured in your soils, what is the carbon sequestration in your forests, what is the level of inequality in your society, and how does it relate to trust, cooperation, and other measures from public health research about social well-being, how do those relate to global goals for planetary health, like the ones that I mentioned a few minutes ago related to the planetary boundaries? Well, I see these functional landscapes and bioregions as the intermediate scale that is something we can organize our efforts around. So this opens up a possibility that we can design a pathway to regenerate the entire planet, that each bioregion increasingly organizes itself as a bioregion around local metrics for social and ecological well-being, while having global systems of measurement for planetary health, things like the planetary boundaries or the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and that we direct our regional efforts toward those global goals. And if we do this in a coherent way, then the regeneration of the entire planet, at least in a conceptual way, becomes possible. From a practical point of view, no one's ever done it, so we don't know if it can be done. But from an ethical place, I think we have an imperative that we need to try. And that's something we can definitely discuss. So another piece of this is that if you look at different efforts to do regenerative design, that they can be seen from the most local scale of backyard permaculture, organic gardening, and things like this, up to regenerative farms, high performance buildings, things that are at the level of a piece of real estate or a piece of property. And then there are things at the community scale like eco-villages, transition towns, neighborhood initiatives, and so on. And then you move up to urban sustainability, which relates to regional planning and things like food sheds and regional food sustainability, regional energy independence, and so on. And this connects to the larger scale of ecosystem restoration, where people are trying to do things like the Los Plateau in China, where they've been restoring about 100,000 acres of land. There's a similar effort currently underway in Spain. And people are now talking about how to restore the stability of the Amazon rainforest, which would be a large-scale ecosystem restoration project. And then I've been talking, or at least alluding to, design at the bioregional scale. But all of this needs to ratchet up to the Earth scale, the planetary scale. Right now, we have a lack of coherence across efforts at these different scales. So we need to create some set of activities that create linkages across scales so that there's a coherence from the local, I am regenerating the soils and creating local food sustainability in my backyard garden, all the way up to large-scale ecosystem restoration, bioregional economies, and restoring planetary health. And this is something that this coherence doesn't exist right now. There's a lot of fragmentation in the world, and there's a really urgent need to create this kind of coherence. So the way that I think about this is that if we can create planetary maps, like this map of degraded soils, where we could say, what if we regenerated these 3 billion hectares of land by doing it region to region, locally, but having some kind of a global monitoring system, that would move us toward restoring planetary health. Because so much research has been aggregated that these kinds of maps can now be created, it's possible to create a planetary scale agenda like this. The piece that I think has been missing is what I have written here at the bottom, that we coordinate these efforts through bioregional learning centers, that we take existing educational institutions, everything from retreat centers and training programs, up through to universities, up through to university research consortiums, and so on, these things that already exist, but begin to organize their efforts around bioregional regeneration with learning centers specifically focused on the bioregional scale that can organize collaboration at the regional scale. And I've made the claim in some of my writings that universities could be well situated to do this. But I suspect all of you know that universities are also so entrenched in historical structures that it's very difficult for them to change and restructure themselves around this kind of work. Which is why I think the smaller schools, the liberal arts colleges, or the land grant universities that might have a public mission could start to do this in more coherent ways based on existing research centers, outreach programs, and study abroad programs and so on, things that already connect to bioregional learning in one way or another, could just increase their coherence in this way and create collaboration from region to region. But that only makes sense if we have planetary scale maps like this to coordinate how regional efforts can achieve planetary goals. Another thing that I've noticed in my work is that there are a lot of what we might call global action networks, meaning place-based projects that have many locations already existing in their networks. And they're trying to drive or increase action or make action more effective around the topics of their networks. And I've got a few examples here of some of the ones that I've worked with or my collaborators have worked with. It's like Transition Towns is bringing permaculture thinking to the transition away from fossil fuels at the community level. Ecosystem Restoration Camps is about organizing learning of students mostly around landscape restoration, but bringing them to different places around the world and creating global learning networks. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a collaboration of about 200 nonprofits that work on policymaking related to economic well-being in one form or another, but they work in cities and small countries around the world. For example, they've been doing a lot of great work in Scotland and in the Devon area of England. And so what I see in networks like these is a considerable capacity for integration of learning if there are learning centers that organize themselves at bioregional scales that could then send students into these networks or draw learning from the place-based projects across these networks with a very impressive diversity of geographies, ecological backgrounds, cultural histories, and so on. Huge opportunities for student projects, project-based learning, and more within networks like these. And this is just a small sampling. There are thousands of networks that exist in this way. These just happen to be networks related to regeneration in one form or another, like the Global Eco-Village Network, where there are several thousand eco-villages. Or if you look at intentional communities, which is a larger network, there are more than 10,000 intentional communities in the world that have formed the International Society for Intentional Communities. And so there are networks like this that become places for coordinating learning or studying how learning is happening. What I'm trying to do in my piece of this is create some kind of a network platform for existing learning centers to do this kind of work and then weave a tapestry among them. So the idea is to create design institutes, just like you might create a learning institute at Concordia College about something like religion, sustainability, and indigenous knowledge. And you might have a research institute that you set up for 2 or 3 years. Well, imagine if we have design institutes around systemic challenges that are related to bioregional regeneration. An example might be how to avoid political capture by fascist totalitarian leaders that are coming into power because of existential anxiety that exists within society, which we see presently in the United States with the 40-year process of polarizing US politics that made the election of someone like President Trump, made that possible. How do we create design institutes around restoring trust and cooperation, reducing polarization, so that those sorts of political capture don't occur? That would be an example of a design institute that might be created that would have highly relevant applications from one region to another. So cooperation or collaboration between regions would make a lot of sense. So the idea of this design institute is to create an emerging network or work with the existing networks that are trying to have coherence together better to organize themselves around bioregional collaboration dedicated to this planetary scale Earth regeneration, and have a specific focus on immersive learning experiences, or what I like to call learning by regenerating. That increasingly, I think that all learning that is happening in our educational institutions needs to have measurable regeneration as its outcomes. Increased trust and cooperation, increased cultural healing, increased soil carbon capture, carbon sequestration, increased biodiversity, increased water cleansing and water filtration, and on and on. That regenerative metrics need to be included in what the learning is creating in its outcome. And that people are learning how to do this increasingly as what they do in their careers and in their educational careers. So the idea is to anchor in many places a singular strategy. The strategy is to weave together all learning efforts: permaculture camps, ecosystem restoration projects, retreat centers, eco-villages, etc. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these already in existence. Interweave these around project-based learning, where the project-based learning is doing regenerative design. We are learning how to regenerate communities and ecosystems, and creating partnerships or taking existing partnerships between universities, nonprofits, social enterprises, impact funds, etc. There are lots of these things floating around, and increasingly organizing them around project-based learning and regenerative design. And this involves the creation of shared curricula. So each learning center, learning institution will have its own curriculum, but it needs to have, or maybe multiple curricula, but it needs to have a philosophical alignment with this role of education for planetary regeneration. And that the students and practitioners that are collaborating with each other in the project-based learning and immersive learning experiences are regenerating their landscapes as the learning that they do. So this idea of navigation pathways is that students can go from a project to working with practitioners to becoming a practitioner themselves. Or they might have part of their learning be at a university, but part of it is at a permaculture camp. Part of it might be at a retreat center or an eco-village, where they're either doing research or doing a project. And they might transition from being a student to being a practitioner as that pathway, so that regenerative design is just what they're doing the entire time. The idea being that in the next 10 years, we need to transition as many people as possible into projects and activities, careers and institutions that are regenerating bioregions and the planet, because we're already in overshoot and there's no time to waste. So another way of thinking of this is if we imagine every place on Earth where social change is occurring as a field site for cultural evolution research, then we can have a way of organizing those field sites around the learning that's happening, so that the education centers that exist in those regions can apply their education and their community service and their projects for to their own backyards and to the ecosystems and landscapes that they depend upon for the cities that they live in and for the other things that make their learning centers possible. And I think I'm going to actually stop here and begin to open this up for discussion. I created a few more slides, but I don't want to go further than this. And I'd love to start a conversation with all of you about how we can take the conversation that you're already having about the core curriculum at Concordia and the different programs that you have, and to think within this context of, if we have 50 years to 70 years, during which time we need to re-stabilize key parts of the Earth system so that they don't cascade further and make it impossible to safeguard humanity's future. We have too much biodiversity loss, too much ocean acidification, too much positive feedback in the climate system. There are things that could drive us to a place where we basically can no longer save ourselves, and all we can do is just document our slow or rapid demise. But there may still be a window of time, 10 to 30 years, where we may have substantial losses that have already become unavoidable, but that we can put ourselves on a course of restabilizing the Earth's capacities to regulate itself so that it begins to restabilize itself. And this is the challenge for us. To give you a concrete way of thinking about this so that it might feel tractable, and I recognize how complex all of this is, but one of the things I've been learning about in the last year is the permaculture design of food forests. And what's interesting about a forest is that a forest has a canopy structure, that in the structure of the canopy itself, once the canopy is established, it becomes self-stabilizing. But if you remove the canopy structure, then it unravels and the whole ecosystem collapses. So the question for us is, what is our planetary scale canopy structure? What are the related structures at different levels that organize themselves to restabilize? And how can we use regional scale efforts, local scale projects to achieve planetary scale goals that reintroduce this kind of self-stabilization? And what is the role of education in that? I see education as fundamental and essential to it, but I'd love to start a conversation about that with you now. So that's the slides that I had. I'd love to hear questions, comments, clarifications, challenges, anything that this provokes in you to talk about.
Thank you, Joe. That's a lot of, I have a lot of questions. I'm sure everyone else does too. So I'll just kind of call on people or moderate. Any questions that you have, maybe some clarifying questions about things that you said first? So I should ask the first one. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about using the Sustainable Development Goals as a guide to designing the curriculum. Some colleges and universities are doing that. And I heard you suggesting something different. You contrasted those with the planetary boundaries approach. Could you say more about that? I mean, it strikes me that if we had a set of, if we were focused on planetary boundaries and what are the different elements that go into maintaining those or rolling back on those, that would be an alternative way to approach it rather than focusing on the SDGs.
Yeah, so I was involved in a project when the Sustainable Development Goals were being approved, where I did a cognitive linguistic analysis, a frame analysis of what was called the zero draft, the draft just before approval. And from that linguistic analysis, we found a couple of key problems with the conceptual structure of the SDGs. One of them was that the SDGs were schizophrenic. Some of the goals make the other goals impossible. In particular, if I remember right, it was goal number 8, but I don't remember the number for sure. The one about sustaining GDP growth, the growth of gross domestic product, and that is required for us to grow our way into sustainability, which some of you have probably studied the inflationary aspects of debt-based currencies and the idea that consumer economies growing at 3% per year in an overshot planet is a recipe for accelerating collapse. So it's inconsistent with some of the other goals. So one of the problems with the SDGs is they are so fragmented in their conceptual structure. I don't remember the number. What is it, like 180 different targets? There's like some huge number of targets in the 17 goals and a huge number of metrics for those targets. You can see how the fragmentation of the 17 goals creates further fragmentation in their measurements. And it's easy to overlook the inconsistencies between the requirement of exponential growth and goal number 8 and other goals like ending poverty or the goal of reducing inequality, which economic growth in development as usual, which is really a hyper form of colonial development, only exacerbates and increases poverty and inequality. It actually does it by design as a form of wealth hoarding. So I see the SDGs as problematic because it's so easy for covert agendas to wiggle their way through all that fragmentation, which was partly in their formulation and is now left in the way that they're structured in their fragmented way. Another problem I have with the SDGs is that because they are separated into 17 goals, they're inherently reductionistic. Now, I've talked to a lot of the people involved in creating them. A lot of them were systemic thinkers. But you look at the SDGs, like what is the relationship between inequality, soil carbon, and something like loss of democracy or the need for the empowerment of women? It's not clear in the structure of the SDGs how they relate to each other because they're not structured in a systemic understanding. What I like about the planetary boundaries framework is that to even understand it, you need to spend some time learning about the interdependencies of the Earth system. So developing a course about the Earth system and its different related parts would be required to understand the planetary boundaries. But once you understand them, so you can see how biodiversity is related to ocean acidification, which is related to something like cloud formation in the atmosphere, which is part of global climate change, that those interdependencies are what we have to manage. And I see that kind of Earth system understanding as being essential. So I'm a strong advocate for that way of thinking. The positive side of incorporating the SDGs is that they have a huge amount of institutional support and a lot of educational resources. So by joining a partner network of using them, you can create some of those as well as benefit from using them. So I recognize the importance also of using them and working in that community. But I also think it's really problematic and could lead to some blind alleys without even knowing it because of that fragmentation.
So I suppose you would substitute it with something like goals for regenerating the earth or goals for regeneration. That's kind of what you're aiming towards.
Yeah, what I would say is that one of the things we need to establish at the core of this is the ecological worldview. And the ecological worldview shows, it emphasizes process and dynamic rather than object and permanence. So it's not about things, it's about dynamic emergence. And it's about interdependencies. And this leads us into a whole realm of management philosophies, aesthetics. It leads us into the discussion of different worldviews that are consistent with ecological thinking. So for example, what do Buddhist practices have to tell us about the embodied mind as an emergent process, and how does that relate to discussions of ethical action? There are lots of interesting ways that that comes about. And so I think of the understanding of the dynamic earth and seeing the living system processes, it does a lot of things, including contextualizing the human story. And this is one of the fundamental things we have to reframe is, are humans part of this planet? And in what ways are we part of it? How do our actions affect it? And what are the ethical responsibilities from that? I think all of those come from that integrated understanding of the earth as a living system. So I see teaching earth systems together with some other related fields, or previously seen as unrelated but essential, could be a really powerful way of designing curriculum.
Yeah.
And Joe, thank you for that. I'm trying to wrap my mind around a whole lot of viewpoints that you're presenting here. As I understand you, two key things here are landscape and cultural evolution. Do you see a relationship, and how do you see the relationship, and can we think about this also in a more concrete way? We are living here on the boundary between the lake country and the prairie, and we've completely changed that whole prairie around. There's no prairie left. What would a learning center here in relationship to that landscape and that culture maybe look like?
One of the things that is really interesting about bioregional design is that to design a bioregion, you need to learn its ecological history and its cultural history. And this is a really fundamental piece. It's related to another aspect of this, which is how regenerative design is taught. Since regeneration is the process of any living system that enables it to continue living, regenerative design is looking at the loss of regenerative processes and then reproducing them with design. And one of the thinkers who's developed this approach is Bill Reed, who's part of the Regenesis group. And I've heard him speak about a project in East Texas, where at one time there was river flowing, a stream that flowed across a specific piece of land. But later they, and that was because the river it was a prairie landscape, there were beavers in the river, and then farmers came in, fenced off the land, put cattle on it, and land use changes, dried out the land, and for 100 years the river stopped flowing. When they came in and asked, how do we regenerate, how do we produce those regenerative processes, including the flow of water, they found that the beavers fundamentally, they did landscaping basically. They changed the function of the landscape to keep water flowing. But in this new environment where there were no beavers, no water had run across the land for 100 years, they had to do permaculture landscaping to imitate what the beavers would have done. And when they did this, within 3 years, water started to flow, and now there's continual permanent flow in that river again. So this was a reconstruction of cultural history of land use practices combined with ecological history of the kind of ecosystem and the functional relationships of the animals and the plants to the land, like the beavers and their relationship to that stream. So if you think in that way about a learning center for your region, one thing you'd be very interested in is the cultural anthropology of the indigenous people. What kind of subsistence food systems did they have? What technologies did they use for housing? Were they permanently placed or semi-nomadic? What were their models of social organization? What kinds of governance did they have? All of that would be very interesting to ask if it was appropriate to the design of your communities today, which does a beautiful job of honoring those traditions and restoring them, teaching that cultural history. But then the ecological piece relates to things like plate tectonics, ice ages, and where you are in Minnesota, you have a lot of glacial activities that have shaped that landscape. So how would you teach that kind of geology and geography piece, which relates to the mapping of the ecosystems and the mapping of the landscapes, because you have to map them to be able to manage them. So this is how bioregional regeneration is done, is by doing these kinds of inquiries into the history of a place. Does that help make it more concrete?
Yeah, it does. When we do some work with prairie restoration and lake biology as well, I'm just concerned about the scale of the agricultural recreation that we've done versus the minimal experiments that we've done in terms of what you were talking about. That's to say, to learn more about the cultural history and the biohistory of the region, which I think is fascinating.
Do others have questions or comments? I'm happy to see it go either way. Discussion peer-to-peer or any other questions that people have.
Well, I was wondering, and it's a little bit along the lines of this this flow of thought, about how you fit in the political context in which we find ourselves. And in particular, when we are thinking about curriculum, how are we making our students, how do we equip our students to kind of with an insight in that, and you know, also economic literacy that they need to have, to kind of envision how restoring and restoration and regeneration can also be economically feasible.
Yeah.
I mean, learning about you know, our indigenous cultures here is extremely important. That I agree with that, but you know, the reality is also that we are living within the reality that was created by colonial enterprises, right? And so going back to the past is maybe not possible. We can only learn from the past and negotiate with the present. And so we need to kind of teach our students to be those to be negotiators in that way. Do I make any sense? I mean, it seems that, that there are other pieces that need to be part of this puzzle.
Yeah, I'll start with the political context, because this is extremely important. One aspect of the political context is to teach cognitive science, to teach people how their minds create meaning, how our emotions shape our moral judgments, how we form social groups and tribal identities around those emotionally shaped moral judgments. And this is like, I've worked in the past with George Lakoff, who's done a lot of this kind of work. And others have done this kind of work as well, and it's extremely important. And one way that's important, I recall when I was at the Rockridge Institute, which was the think tank that George Lakoff had founded, we had about a 6-month-long ongoing discussion with what we were learning about cognitive science. We wondered if it was even possible to have democracy. There's so many ways to manipulate people's meaning-forming process, to shape what their worldviews are and shape their judgments, that it may not be possible to have democracy with this knowledge existing. But our basic position was, this knowledge now exists. People are using it to manipulate other people. So there's a need to democratize the knowledge. That if we learn how the mind works, then we are able to engage in politics, understanding what politics is in a deeper way. And I see this as one element that is really important to bring into the design of curriculum. And you could do this with behavioral science, with things like research in psychology, with cognitive neuroscience, also with linguistics, with poetry, with the English program where you look at literature and storytelling, and actually with theater and immersive experiential storytelling and meaning making. There are lots of domains of this that are highly relevant to politics. I just think of cognitive science as an organizing place only because it's so important to understand how the mind works as part of this. It's sort of a blind spot until we learn how important the mind is. It's a place we can be manipulated. And we have to nullify that manipulation by making it known. It's sort of like teaching cognitive biases to help people make better decisions is just a worthwhile thing to do for critical thinking. There's a broader and deeper version of that. So that's one thing I'd say that's really important. Another thing that I think is really important is, earlier I described really briefly what social niche construction is. Part of the evolution of humans is the way that we created conceptual abilities for language. Our ancestors did this going back probably 3 million years with the invention of Stone Age tools, what are called the Oldowan tools. They made cutting wedges from rocks, which shows that they had the conceptual ability for metaphor. They could look at a rock and see a functional use in the rock and then shape it to create that use. That meant they had conceptual metaphor. One thing that created was a place of shared attention where a teacher could point at the rock and chip away at it to show the learner how to chip away at it. And this created a social niche of shared understanding. Language evolved in this social niche. Now language, or semantics, is a social niche where we have a lot of political reality that occurs. And it is an inherited environment, and also an environment that we can do design work in. And so if we start to think about the role of social niches understood in this deep and pervasive way, we can ask ourselves things like, what are the stories that my culture tells me? Are those stories true or not? Or in what ways were they true at some time in the past, but now the world has changed and they may or may not be true anymore? That starting to do this will make us more astute participants in politics, because we start to see how we co-create politics as social niches. And so that's another way of thinking about this. As you go into projects for collaboration and co-creation, where you need different groups to work together, that these kinds of skills and insights become really important. So that doesn't address all of it, but it's a couple of rabbit holes we could go further down.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Any questions maybe related to are thinking about the curriculum. Right? Of course, if we did what Joe wants, then we would completely transform the way we organize the college and the curriculum.
Well, one thing that I have with that is that, you know, if I may, if no one else wants to.
Matthew had.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you've seen in terms of how, if you've observed educational institutions and how they've, well, and I'm thinking especially of our context, how they've kind of retuned themselves or kind of started with this, you know, this history of these ways of doing things, and then found a way to move into, you know, these other ways of doing things. If you have any, if you've observed that, and what sorts of insights you might have about that process.
One thing that I've seen that's a common practice for universities is to have sort of international immersion programs. Like I spent the last year living at a place called Rancho Margot in northern Costa Rica, and a lot of universities bring their students there because it's in a biodiversity hotspot, and they have done a lot of regenerative design of self-sufficient food systems, local energy production, and so on. And so a lot of universities already do this. One thing that I would say is that partly this is just an augmentation of existing functions. There are things that universities already do that could be understood as part of a new arrangement of relationships. So those immersion programs or exchange programs that are already valuable because they cost less to sort of outsource them. Students do them as independent study or another way so that they don't cost the university as much in terms of overhead for infrastructure. That's something that's already been happening. So a question would be, how would that relate to local economic development or local cultural or community engagement activities? And I think there is another place where you can see some sort of successes that don't get celebrated very much. Like in the United States, we have the Agricultural Extension Program, which has really been successful at teaching people how to destroy the earth using fossil fuels with industrial agriculture. But if you step back and look at it as a model of community learning, it's fantastic. It really works well. And so it's got a history of being used to teach things that we now know shouldn't be taught. I think it's still teaching those things too much. But if you look at the structure of it and its history, how it was funded, how companies would collaborate to support education, how community groups like church groups and Rotary International and other community groups would collaborate with it, that it really is a successful model of social learning connected to universities already. So partly this is about seeing that we have this period of time where we sort of have one mission. Our mission is to restabilize the planet. And we can name that in different ways, but you know, if we recognize that that is our mission and think about how we describe it, then each place has a part to play in that mission. And then we can look at these existing pieces of legacy infrastructure or legacy programs and ask, how would we retool them for this? Now, another thing I've started to see that is more experimental and hasn't really proven itself out very much yet, but is a place that I think shows a lot of promise, is in the creation of social impact funds as they relate to regenerative farming. Because here's a place where three things are being put together. Financing is being put together with changing of land use, with a management structure that requires social learning. You have to teach farmers how to farm differently. So there's an educational piece, a land use piece, and a finance piece. If you put those three together into one package, and you ask, who are the people that would fund the change of land use that requires education to be done for it to work? Then you have a potential revenue model for the teaching piece. Because you could have internships where the students are paid. You could have projects where investors would fund student scholarships or student project stipends to do the projects. Like my wife did her master's in public administration at the University of Washington in Seattle. at the Evans School. And they have a degree program where to get your master's degree, you have to do a degree project. And there are local government entities and nonprofits that pay money to the university, to the program, to have the students do their master's projects with them, because they basically work as consultants with the local organization as a client. So you can see how there are models of education where local clients would pay your program to teach students to do projects if you have good quality projects. So that's another model that has been demonstrated that connects projects to financial flow to learning. So something like that might be an engine for some of your programs.
So what if we focus this on, if you want to have an education that's focused on regeneration, and we're thinking about changing our common curriculum, the things that all students should encounter, or the knowledge that all students should gain, or the skills that they should all gain. From your perspective, what would be the core elements? If you could design a core curriculum for all students in colleges, what would that look like?
Foundational one is empathy, the ability to take perspectives and to have compassion and care. Connected to that would be mindfulness training, contemplative practices, to give people the emotional regulation abilities to maintain that perspective taking and that compassion. I see that as even more fundamental than critical thinking, and actually it enables critical thinking. So the critical thinking remains, but in complement with it. I also see eco-literacy and nature immersion as being absolutely essential and really hard to do, which is why you would probably need partnerships with places where nature is still intact. So that's another piece that I think is really important. Systems thinking is really important, including some of the work that's been done in complexity science or studying complex adaptive systems. I see the study of emergence in particular, how interacting things can create novel patterns that are unexpected, and how to work with it, especially the management of emergence. By the way, my best training for emergence was not in complexity science. It was that I did improv theater, martial arts sparring, and improvisational dance. Those were the parts of my training that when I help people work with complexity, I studied complexity as a physicist and mathematician, but my skills came from body-based practice. So bringing those body-based practices in, I think would be really important to your core curriculum. And I also think a spiritual ethic of caring for nature. I would call it the Gaia ethic. You could call it something different if you like, but basically seeing that the life force of the earth, this 3.8 billion years of the biosphere, of which we are part, is all sacred life that we know of in the universe. How do we become ethical and spiritual in relation to it? The eco-literacy piece is essential to that, but there's something else. And I know Concordia College has a long history of religious education. And this could be Laudato Si, by the way, because Pope Francis described it beautifully in Laudato Si. Taking the encyclical and bringing it into your curriculum would be a good idea. Another thing that I think is underutilized and really powerful is the Earth Charter. Bringing the Earth Charter in, teaching it as a model of governance. It's like the Bill of Rights for the Gaia age or for the Anthropocene. So that's an interesting thing to think about bringing into your curriculum or something like it. Another thing is collaboration skills. I've been learning a specific methodology called pro-social, which combines Eleanor Ostrom's work for governing the commons with Steve Hayes' work on contextual behavioral science and what's called acceptance and commitment therapy, and David Sloan Wilson's work on cultural multi-level selection. Basically what it does is it creates a tool set for creating functional groups and guiding the evolution of groups consciously. The groups evolve themselves. And so I think some techniques like this would be really useful to teach. In addition to the basic math skills for rigorous logical thinking and pattern analysis, which I think are really important, appropriately taught. across the curriculum. I think that bringing back a deeper knowledge of history, in a way it's how did we get here, would be a good thing to teach. So if you pick the Anthropocene as a way of organizing your curriculum or part of it, how did we leave the Holocene and enter the Anthropocene is a really interesting inquiry to ask how did we get here? Or what was the unique historical moment of fossil fuels that led us to here that's going to run out, and to see it as a transition process rather than as some plateau that we're going to permanently be at, which is untenable because it's not renewable. So there's some interesting questions like this that how did we get here? I think you could build into the curriculum. And another one is something that is being talked about a lot in design practices and design schools, which is the idea of keeping the future open. There are types of design that close off possible futures, and there are types of design that hold possible futures open. So how can you get your students to think about how to hold future possibilities open, to see how they might close off, and then keep them from closing off as a design ethic, which is related to the study of emergence. But it's going to be really important to see things that are in the process of closing off and learn how to keep them open. Like, oh, polarization is closing off our ability as a community to cooperate. How do we keep that open? Is something else to think about. So I just threw a bunch of stuff at you, but I know you're recording this, so someone can go back and capture it if you didn't get notes. But I would say things like this would be like a 21st century liberal arts education. I'm sure I'm missing some stuff, but these are some of the ones I'd think of.
That's very useful, very interesting. Yeah. Questions or comments following up on this or a different thing?
All right, I got one. David, theater guy over here in the corner. I don't think we're unique in this, but it feels like our social environment that we're in right now, where the students are coming from and their families, are very conservative. And so have you seen models of how institutions like ours have transitioned from something that is very pro-business, pro-growth, right? You know, I'm so worried that my kid isn't going to get a job, and college is so expensive, right? The parents and families and kids are all very focused on the economics. Do you have examples of any stories that are successful?
I actually don't have stories that are successful because it's really difficult to solve this one. I think one of the problems, I mean, there are levels to this question. One level is that a couple of $1 billion have been invested in a massive infrastructure of manipulation. You know, just go into Google and type in Mont Pelerin Society and look at the history of neoliberalism and the rise of, there are more than 800 think tanks just in the United States, and lots of media institutions and stuff that have built up this specific story of human nature as being inherently individualistic and selfish, and all decisions being economic in this way. And so it's going to be really difficult to dig your way back out of that when so many of the cultural tides have been entrenched in this direction. But one place you might look is the National Association of Evangelicals has created some really good documents about how to talk about creation care. And it might be worthwhile to just go and look at them and see how that community is trying to bring environmentalism into the evangelical churches. Because I think you're going to find a lot of your more politically conservative students are actually environmental progressives without knowing it, because they just never learned that they were. And you might find that it's a language problem, that there might be specific words you can use that pull you so much out of that economic dogma that you can still talk about it. And it might be, you know, pulling out Bible references that are relevant, because some of them are really good. But I think the National Association of Evangelicals has created some really good inquiries into this, because a lot of their members, tens of millions of evangelical Christians, care about the environment. They still vote Republican. So there's a disconnect there, because the Republican Party is a tool of neoliberal fascist corporatism, just like a lot of the Democratic Party has become as well. So much of that capture has happened. People identify tribally, but they also know there's something wrong with the system. And so if you can get in at that core value and identity level and have a meaningful conversation, like one of the problems that a lot of people who call themselves conservatives, one of the problems they're dealing with is the collapse of family values in our societies. Well, as a progressive, I completely agree. We've lost family values. So how do we talk about that? One thing is family values is not pissing in your own swimming pool. So what are we doing with our rivers? You know, you can start to have these conversations in ways that people can resonate with that are appropriate to your place. The way I always said this when I did the frame analysis work was, you know your culture better than I do. I would just advise you to look at core values as they relate to identity, and then talk to them where your values actually are the same. And one of the challenges we have right now is that there's no economic future on a dead planet. And there's really so much of our economic future is going to be in regenerating things. So much of it is going to be relocalization. Undoing the Walmart phenomenon is a big part of this. So small and medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurship, but within a regenerative lens, where businesses are serving these life-giving processes. So in some ways, it's how do you bring that life-giving conversation to their politics and their religious views in a way that makes sense to them, and then bring them on a learning journey. It could be about building an ethical life. That might be how you get to them. I'm not sure, but that's what I would advise you to do. And I'd say I don't know of good examples because it's just really hard.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you for that. I'm a Hilda Koster. I teach in the religion department, and I teach ecology and religion. And this morning I thought Laudato Si. So we do quite a bit of that already. We find that our students are all over the map. You know, they might be where you know, in the evangelical camp. They might just not be religious at all, but they're here because their families are. So, you know, focusing on that language for connecting one way or the other is indeed important. And Laudato Si is a fantastic document, not on gender. I have to say that, not on gender. So, yeah, so, but I want to, you know, the issue here, I think, is even more that liberal, you know, that education is so squeezed financially, and that our families are mostly middle class, and so that's why they're so focused on what you can actually do with an education like this, and so they're very much focused on the outcome in terms of jobs. So I wondered whether you had any advice for us there when we revise our curriculum.
Now, one thing I think is going to become more important as time goes on is the living systems principle of robust circulation. If you don't have blood flowing through your body, then whichever part of your body doesn't get blood, it dies off. Same is true for economies. That you're going to have the challenge that as money leaves your community, or actually for 40 years, money has been extracted from your community.
Yes.
That's why everyone feels so tight. So what can you do to recirculate the money that's already there? So an example might be within your alumni network, you might have some people that are interested in regional scale or within the city that are already doing some of this. How could you convene them and create special programs and special scholarships or other things to make it more affordable for young people to come? Or giving opportunities for local people to go to your school instead of some other school, but then having them do community projects as part of receiving their scholarships, and having conversations with local alumni or with local family foundations, local businesses that you might try to create an education fund, or you may already have some of this in existence, but just start to, you know, move it in this direction from wherever it is. Because I think part of your challenge is going to be how to have an upward spiral of circulation of money rather than how to create a new flow of money. Like, you're not going to necessarily get people who have money that aren't currently in your system. It's how do you get the money in your system to recirculate? People who have already been students before, can they recirculate it? Can the families of your students recirculate it? Can your community that you're in recirculate it? And then you're just looking for, what are those collaborative structures? Are there trust funds that you might create within the university or within the college? Is there a community development fund that's within the municipal government or the state government? Some other place you might find it? Are there places where you can find in-kind contributions, existing projects that other people are funding, but that you could bring the skills of your institution to, that might leverage into additional funding? These are all things to just think about, because one of the things I learned when I was looking at global inequality was back in 2010, the Global Tax Justice Network tried to estimate how much money was in the tax haven system. They estimated between 24 and $37 trillion. So roughly a third of the global economy is hidden in tax havens. And those are low, those are minimum numbers. It could be higher. So there's a reason why all of our institutions are cash strapped. There's a reason why there are 1,400 billionaires, and that 8 families have half the world's private wealth. That's all the design of the system right now. So the question becomes, how do you work with people who are at that close to local scale that have funds to recirculate? Like, is there a philanthropist or a foundation within the state or within your bioregion? They might even be in Canada and just be close enough from a regional connection that would be interested in jointly forming an educational initiative that could then include scholarships or job placement. These are just things that I'm sure you're already thinking a lot about, but within the context of bioregional regeneration, you have a way of telling the story. You say, our campus is going to focus on our region. Who in our region is a partner or might be a partner that wasn't before? That's why I call that the functional landscape as an organizing principle. It's a way of organizing or thinking about these kinds of things.
It seems like the thing that you said, Hilda, about teach our students to be negotiators. And then you mentioned the economic future lies in regenerating things. There's a way in which a college like ours could get ahead of the curve, because regenerating things, who would ever object to that, right? Regenerating. So the things that you mentioned, teaching our students these things so that they can go out and regenerate things, it could be a powerful kind of message to give to students. I want to ask, before our time's up, I want to ask one thing that you didn't mention in your talk, but was in that Guiding the Emergence of Humanity's Future document.
Yeah.
Those of you who read it may have seen that it relates to another thing that's on our mind. And you said, you wrote about how we need to think about being planetarians, not globalists. And that's a nice clarifying thing, I think, because globalist, as you meant it there, was people who aren't rooted in any specific place. And we've seen this backlash against globalism. So at Concordia, we're also wondering, what does global mean? What does it mean to say we're educating global citizens or whatever? So do you see planetarian we've used the phrase planetary citizenship before in some stuff that Pear's done and others. Do you see this as an alternative to globalist? Should we move away from the notion of globalism and globalists and instead embrace a new frame of planetarian, which, as I read you, means we're deeply connected to a particular place while also being connected and mindful of the larger planetary health and planetary system?
Yeah, the person who made that distinction was Peter Berg. He was the writer and thinker who used the word planetarian. And he would always describe himself as being from a place starting with the tectonic plate, followed by the watershed, followed by the local place, then the city, then the neighborhood. He lived in San Francisco. And so we always talked about his tectonic plate as part of the San Andreas Fault Line as his home. And he did that as a mindfulness practice of where he was on the planet. And I think he was onto something really important, which is the word global doesn't, the globe is actually, is a symbolic abstraction from the planet. The globe is an object, right? If you think of what a globe is, it's a map that projects some interpretation of the earth onto a sphere. or an oblate spheroid if it does it accurately. So if you have a globe right now with the 200 nations on it, nation states have existed for 100 or so years. That globe is an abstract symbolism of the planet. And so being a planetarian is stepping back and instead having a socially constructed meaning of the planet, which is the globe, and instead having the planet as the planet that we relate to. That's really what he was getting at. And I think planetary citizen captures it really well. And that's a phrase that's been around for a while. If I say I'm a planetary citizen, then I'm going to take care of my watershed, because my watershed's part of my planet. And planetary thinking is nested levels. My local place is connected to something larger, it's connected to something larger, until I get to the planetary scale. So I think that's really important. And the other thing he was getting at with that terminology was the difference between being a resident and being an inhabitant. For him, an inhabitant came from the word inhabit, which comes from the word habitat. He was a street theater performer before he got into his other work. So he did a lot of plays on words to mess with people's minds. And so inhabitant as inhabiting a habitat was a way of getting people to think of their local ecology. And that was a powerful way of thinking for him as a bioregional thinker. So this idea of being an inhabitant instead of a resident is someone who lives here as long as there's a job here. An inhabitant is someone whose niche is here, which means this place is where their survival is. It's who they are, it's where they're from. And this is about learning to live in place. So if you start to develop some of your curriculum around how to live in place, as another way of thinking about your curriculum, then being a planetary citizen lets you do all the global studies kinds of work that you do, because all of that still is very important, but it allows you to connect it to local identity and local living, which a lot of global studies work in the earlier days wasn't doing as consistently. Some did, some didn't. I also think the framing of planetary health, where you take public health and extend it to the planetary scale, is also a useful reframing to think about that's related to being a planetary citizen. So, so there are lots of pieces of that that are generative. There's just a lot there to think about. It's really useful to think with.
Great, so we're pretty much at 5:30, so we need to wrap up. And I know I have a lot more questions. And I think there's a lot of things percolating in our minds. You've raised a lot of issues, a lot of things to think about that I think many of us will want to kind of bring to others and bring it to our conversation. So we thank you, Joe, for taking the time to talk with us. We'll give you applause. You're far away, but you know. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. And thank you to Ahmed for finding you and bringing you here so we can talk to you. So
I'm just excited to hear that you are, as a group, inquiring so deeply into your curriculum. I know how difficult it is to change educational institutions. So I just applaud you for this, for taking the moment of pause to reflect on, as my friend Rachel Bagby likes to say, is how do you go from wow to how now shall I live? And she makes a pause in the middle. Wow is like, wow, the world's fucked up. Wow, this is amazing. From that wow place, you pause, and then you reflect, and then you ask, how do I live? And I feel like what you're doing with your discussion of your curriculum is taking that place in between and holding it open. So even if you're not able to do the deep work as much as you would like, just holding that open as an inquiry is so important, because we're in a time of such significance. So I just really want to give back to you that gift that you're giving to yourselves. It's so important that you're doing this work right now. So thank you for doing it.
thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.